Prisoner Designation 7734. A human logistics coordinator named Marcus Webb sentenced to indefinite confinement following a trade dispute. The Krivath Compact's judicial system had classified as economic sabotage. Arrived at Threxis Maximum Detention Facility expecting. By every account, his own considerable prior research into the facility had suggested a life sentence spent in the specific. Brutal obscurity. The facility's 400 inmate population structure, typically imposed on new arrivals regardless of species or background. 7 days later, Warden Vesik Korath found himself, for the first time in his considerable 18-year administrative career, negotiating cell block resource allocation directly with the facility's newest prisoner, because every other inmate on Block 7 had, within a single week, begun deferring to Marcus Webb's judgment on matters the facility's own considerable security apparatus had never once permitted a prisoner to influence. Threxis Maximum Detention Facility housed, across its considerable 400 inmate capacity, representatives from 11 different species convicted of crimes severe enough to warrant the facility's particular combination of extended isolation, resource scarcity, and the specific, carefully calibrated social pressure that compact penal doctrine had refined across 2 centuries into what its own considerable research classified as maximally effective long-term behavioral suppression. The facility's internal social structure, documented extensively across the considerable prior research that had informed its design, operated according to a predictable, well-established hierarchy, dominance patterns that emerged organically among the facility's most physically imposing or socially aggressive inmates. A structure the facility's own administrative doctrine had always treated as a useful, self-regulating mechanism, requiring minimal direct intervention. Marcus Webb arrived with none of the physical or social characteristics his considerable prior research into the facility's established hierarchy would have suggested were necessary for any inmate to achieve meaningful social standing within Block 7's particular, considerably brutal social ecosystem. Intake assessment indicates unremarkable physical capability relative to Block 7's existing population, reported the facility's intake officer, reviewing Marcus Webb's processing documentation with the standard, cursory professional interest. The facility extended to new arrivals whose profile suggested no particular administrative concern. Prisoner shows no combat training, no notable physical advantage, and demonstrates the standard psychological stress markers typical of new human arrivals adjusting to detention conditions. Recommend standard integration protocol, with expected adjustment period consistent with typical human intake patterns. What the facility's standard intake assessment had genuinely failed to properly account for, buried beneath a physical and psychological profile that suggested nothing beyond ordinary human vulnerability within a considerably more hostile detention environment, was the specific professional background that Marcus Webb's considerable prior career had actually developed, a fact that would become, across the following 7 days, the subject of increasingly urgent administrative concern within Threxis Maximum Detention Facility's own considerable command structure. Marcus Webb had spent 14 years, prior to his conviction, working as a logistics coordinator for a considerable multinational supply chain corporation, a career that had specifically required him to develop expertise in exactly the kind of complex resource allocation, conflict resolution, and coordinated multi-party negotiation that Threxis Maximum Detention Facility's own considerable brutal, resource-scarce internal economy had never previously encountered from any prior inmate. Day 2 status, recorded the facility's internal security monitoring, documenting an initial pattern that would, across the following 5 days, escalate into something the facility's considerable administrative apparatus had genuinely never previously required a formal protocol to address. Prisoner 7734 has begun engaging directly with multiple inmate factions regarding disputed resource allocation, specifically regarding the block's contested meal distribution schedule. An ongoing source of documented interspecies tension, our facility's considerable prior data indicates, has produced significant violent incident across multiple previous inmate populations. Prisoners' engagement does not follow the typical pattern our security protocols are calibrated to monitor: direct confrontation or alliance building toward eventual dominance. Prisoner instead appears to be conducting what our monitoring can only describe as structured negotiation sessions, methodically identifying each faction's specific underlying grievance rather than simply their stated positional demands. Warden Korath, reviewing the facility's increasingly detailed monitoring reports with genuine professional confusion, requested direct consultation with the facility's senior psychological officer regarding a pattern the facility's own considerable prior experience across 2 centuries of operation had never previously required it to properly categorize. "I do not fully understand the mechanism," Dr. Vesselthane admitted, during a formal briefing convened 4 days into Marcus Webb's detention, presenting security data that had, by that point, generated genuine institutional concern extending beyond routine administrative interest. Prisoner 7734 has, within 4 days, successfully mediated 3 separate disputes that our facility's own considerable prior data indicates typically require direct staff intervention, and in several documented previous cases, have escalated into violent incident requiring extended isolation protocol. He is not achieving this through the dominance-based social positioning our facility's established hierarchy structure typically requires. Multiple inmate factions, including several with documented prior hostility toward each other extending across considerable periods of shared confinement, are voluntarily deferring to his mediation, a behavioral pattern our considerable prior psychological research has never previously documented at this scale or speed. Marcus Webb, interviewed directly by Warden Korath during a formal consultation convened specifically to understand a phenomenon the facility's own considerable administrative doctrine had genuinely never previously required it to address, offered an explanation that reflected, with considerable directness, the specific professional expertise his prior career had actually developed. "I don't think I'm doing anything particularly complicated, honestly, Warden," he said during the formal interview, addressing a question that had, by that point, generated genuine confusion across the facility's entire considerable administrative structure. "I spent 14 years managing supply chain logistics for a company that operated across considerable competing regional and departmental interests, all of whom had their own legitimate grievances about resource allocation, timeline priorities, and considerable historical resentment toward each other that had built up over years of imperfect prior negotiation. I learned across those 14 years that most conflicts over scarce resources aren't actually about the resources themselves. Not really. They're about whether the people involved feel like their actual underlying needs are being genuinely heard and fairly considered, rather than just having some arbitrary allocation imposed on them by whoever happens to hold administrative authority at the time. Your facility's meal distribution dispute, for example, wasn't really about the specific quantity of food each faction was receiving. It was about the fact that nobody had ever actually asked any of these factions what their genuine underlying concerns were, beyond the surface-level complaint about portion size. Once I actually sat down with each group and asked, properly, what was actually driving their frustration, it turned out the real issue was considerably more specific and considerably more solvable than the surface conflict suggested. Warden Korath, whose considerable 18-year administrative career had never once required him to seriously reconsider the facility's fundamental operational assumptions, found himself, Across the following days, genuinely reassessing a management philosophy his own considerable professional training had always treated as settled, established doctrine. You are suggesting our facility's considerable prior conflict resolution failures reflect inadequate mediation methodology, rather than any inherent, unmanageable hostility among our diverse inmate population, he said, during a subsequent, considerably more extended consultation that had, by that point, evolved well beyond its original narrow administrative purpose. I think that's probably part of it, yeah, Marcus said. Though I want to be careful not to oversell what I'm actually doing here, Warden, because I don't think I've solved anything your facility couldn't have solved eventually, given the right approach. I'm not doing anything magical. I'm just applying the same basic principles that governed every difficult negotiation I ever handled in my prior career. Listen to what people actually need, not just what they're initially demanding. Find the places where different parties' genuine underlying interests actually overlap, even when their surface positions seem completely incompatible. And be honest, consistently, even when honesty means telling somebody something they don't particularly want to hear. Most conflict, in my experience, isn't actually driven by genuinely irreconcilable interests. It's driven by nobody having taken the time to properly understand what those interests actually are. Underneath all the initial positioning and posturing everybody does when they're trying to protect themselves in a resource-scarce environment. The facility's internal social restructuring, which Warden Korath's own considerable subsequent formal report would document extensively across the following months, produced results that fundamentally challenged assumptions the facility's entire two-century operational doctrine had never previously required it to question. Block 7's documented violent incident rate has decreased by 73% within the first month following prisoner 7734's arrival. The formal report stated, presenting data that generated considerable broader administrative interest, extending well beyond Threx's maximum detention facility's own considerable jurisdiction. This reduction correlates directly with prisoner 7734's increasingly formalized mediation role within the block's internal social structure, a role our facility's administrative staff has, after considerable internal deliberation, chosen to formally recognize and support, rather than suppress as an unauthorized challenge to established institutional authority. The decision, which Warden Korath's own considerable professional reputation would eventually become closely associated with across broader compact penal administration circles, represented a fundamental departure from 2 centuries of established detention facility doctrine. One that Dr. Vessel Thane's own extensive subsequent psychological analysis would characterize as a genuinely unprecedented recognition of a specific human capability. The compact's considerable prior penal research had simply never adequately theorized. Our facility's entire operational doctrine has always assumed that internal social hierarchy among a diverse, resource-scarce inmate population would inevitably organize around dominance and physical intimidation, requiring extensive administrative intervention to maintain acceptable violence levels. Dr. Thane wrote, in her own extensive formal research on the phenomenon, eventually published across compact penal psychology academic circles, as one of the most significant reconsiderations of established detention doctrine in the field's considerable recent history. Prisoner 7734's demonstrated capability suggests an alternative organizational principle our doctrine has never previously accounted for, one grounded not in physical dominance, but in a specific, apparently trainable capacity for structured, empathetic conflict mediation that appears capable of producing sustained social stability, considerably exceeding what our traditional dominance hierarchy model has ever achieved across 2 centuries of prior operational data. I do not believe this reflects some unique individual anomaly specific to prisoner 7734 alone. I believe, based on subsequent research extending across several additional facility trials, incorporating similarly trained human mediators, that this represents a genuinely trainable human professional skill set, developed through their species' considerable prior experience, managing complex organizational and commercial relationships. One our own compact penal doctrine has never previously recognized as strategically applicable to detention facility administration. Marcus Webb, whose own life sentence remained, throughout the entirety of the facility's broader administrative reassessment, formally unchanged despite his increasingly significant informal influence over Block 7's daily operation, offered a final reflection during a considerably later interview conducted years into his continued detention that would become, within subsequent compact penal reform discussions, one of the most frequently cited principles regarding the phenomenon his own arrival had inadvertently generated. People keep asking me if I feel like I've accomplished something remarkable here, running this block the way I have, he said, addressing a question that had, by that point, followed him across several years of continued, if considerably more comfortable, confinement. I don't really think about it that way, honestly. I think I just did what any decent logistics coordinator would do, faced with a system where scarce resources were being allocated without anybody actually listening to the people affected by those decisions. I didn't come here trying to run anything, warden. I came here trying to survive a life sentence in a facility I had every reason to expect would be considerably more brutal and considerably more hopeless than it's actually turned out to be. I just applied the only skill set I actually had, because it was the only thing I knew how to do, and it turned out that skill set was considerably more useful in here than anybody, including me, initially expected. I don't think that makes me special. I think it just means somebody finally tried treating conflict resolution in a place like this as an actual skill worth developing, instead of just assuming violence and dominance were the only possible organizing principles a population like ours could ever produce. Maybe that's the real lesson here, if there is one. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can bring into a genuinely difficult situation isn't strength, or size, or even hope, exactly. It's just somebody finally willing to sit down and actually listen to what everybody involved genuinely needs, instead of assuming you already know.